Upon the conclusion of the conflict, the remaining Jews were not welcomed with hugs, nor with fairness. No residents awaited their return, nor family anticipating them, nor a nation that desired them. Amidst wreckage, razor wire that remained partially closed, mismatching identification documents, and scorching memories, they commenced a precarious journey. This narrative traces their movements, from the camps for displaced persons to the quiet banishments, from the unfeasible rebuilding to the shattered recollection. Because survival was not a joyous finale, it was scarcely the start. Emancipation sans liberty. During the days and weeks the camps were unlocked, freedom possessed no glory. For numerous Jews, the anticipated instant arrived too late, amidst rot, starvation, pestilence, and mortality. What the Allied troops discovered were not celebratory humans standing tall, but shivering skeletal figures swathed in cloths with empty gazes. Some failed to comprehend they were being liberated. Others could no longer move, utter words, or recall their identities. When British forces accessed Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, they located over 10,000 unburied bodies and roughly 60,000 captives dying at a pace of hundreds daily. The photographs circled the globe. Common graves, makeshift stretchers, wooden crematoria, physicians fainting from fatigue, survivors passing away after eating because their systems could no longer digest sustenance. British medical teams attempted swift action, yet were unequipped for the sights. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, severe malnutrition. At Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, or Theresienstadt, the scenario recurred, each possessing its unique torment. Certain prisoners did not await rescue. In the Third Reich's final days, thousands were deserted by guards or released by armed civilians. Elsewhere, the SS merely escaped in disguise, attempting to blend unseen within the liberated. At Gunskirchen, for instance, American troops freed a camp where corpses were so piled that walking without treading on them proved impossible. Many liberators wept, others retched. None departed unharmed. To the majority of Jews surviving the Holocaust, the war's conclusion marked not a commencement, but a pause. Devastation did not cease in May of 1945. It simply altered shape. Often, liberation was a sluggish, vague ordeal, defined by displacement, constant starvation, confusion, shame, and dread. According to Michael Brenner, in the weeks following the Third Reich's collapse, the camp system survivors remained under Allied guard, segregated from civilians, stateless, paperless, homeless, and without kin to seek. Many concentration camps were momentarily turned into transit centers for freed captives. In Bergen-Belsen, for instance, where over 35,000 people perished between January and May of 1945, the British faced an unexampled sanitary disaster. Bodies lay heaped outdoors, maladies spread wildly, and barracks were so lice-infested they required burning. The British were compelled to remove survivors and construct a fresh camp divided by wire where former captives would be nourished, vaccinated, and gradually sorted. The term they utilized was internees. For those arriving from Auschwitz, Mauthausen, or Dachau, continuing to slumber on cots, continuing to view armed sentries, continuing to hear shouted commands, did not resemble in any fashion the concept one might hold of liberty. One of the most wrenching accounts of this phase comes from Norbert Wollheim, survivor of Buna and observer of the chaos in the British zone. Wollheim recounts how Jews liberated in northern Germany were totally alone. Deserted in ruined villages, sleeping in barns, ignored by a German populace that chose not to see them. Allied occupation did not instantly imply care for survivors. Frequently, American or British commanders failed to differentiate between ex-prisoners and general displaced persons, even confining Jews and former SS members in identical quarters, as in Feldafing or initially in Buchenwald. The involvement of Rabbi Abraham Klausner and other Jewish envoys dispatched by global agencies was vital to require distinct and specific care for the genocide survivors. From the summer of 1945 onward, displaced persons camps, DP camps, started being founded under Allied rule but with restricted autonomy. They were arranged by the nationality or ethnicity of the interned. Poles on one side, Ukrainians on another, Jews in separate sectors. Effectively, many such camps became tiny autonomous Jewish societies with schools, synagogues, religious tribunals, libraries, presses, and Zionist groups. Yet they remained camps with barriers, rules, and guards. Existence there was not a festival of survival, but a protracted and aching transit toward the unknown. The survivors possessed grounds to doubt the exterior world. Those attempting to return to hometowns in Lublin, Lvov, Krakow, or Kielce discovered locked gates, frigid stares, whispered slurs, and even gunfire. In July of 1946 in Kielce, a crowd killed 42 Jews who had survived the war. The cause, a rumor regarding the ritual abduction of a youngster. The Nazis were gone, yet structural anti-Semitism still breathed in the hamlets and streets. For many, the signal was plain. You survived, but we do not desire you here. The count of Jews liberated in Germany between 1945 and 1947 surpassed 250,000. The bulk were not Germans, but Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, and Romanians, deported to Reich camps. In areas like Upper Bavaria, southern Hesse, and northern Austria, improvised kibbutzim emerged, led by Zionist movements like Hashomer Hatzair or Bnei Akiva. They trained in farming tasks. Children were schooled in Hebrew and prepared for immigration to Palestine. In sites like Landsberg, Vorenwald, or Feldafing, Jewish life briefly bloomed amidst rubble, yet always with the realization that this earth was not and would never be a home. In the camps, bodily trauma vied with emotional trauma. Many survivors knew not if they were the sole family members alive. They sought names on lists, hung on poles, in papers, on community boards. Often they met silence or voids. Others found individuals claiming to be kin, or groups claiming to have found their offspring. In the instance of children, notably the youngest, there was a battle for identity and memory. Was that their name? Were those their parents? Were they Jewish? Or had they been baptized by Catholic households to save them? Frequently the children did not wish to exit the convent, did not wish to leave the family that raised them, and failed to comprehend why someone insisted they alter their speech, their dress, their faith. In France, Belgium, and Hungary, this fight reached the tribunals. The matter of the child Robert Goldstein, whose custody was demanded by a Jewish group against the wishes of his Catholic adoptive family, displays the complexity and emotional force of those shifts. Meanwhile, Allied bureaucracy held no solutions. The United States kept migration limits and Palestine lay under British rule. Thousands of Jews stayed trapped in Europe sans destination, sans legal standing, sans citizenship. For the British, the Jews of the DP camps were a humanitarian issue, but also a political threat, particularly when secret immigration webs, the Bricha and later the Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, started moving thousands toward Italian or French harbors in makeshift vessels attempting to dodge the British naval blockade in Palestine. The chronicle of those years is a tale of waiting, of confinement, of starvation, and of blind rebuilding. Not all managed to depart. Not all survived the winter of 1946. Sickness continued to cause ruin. Penicillin came late, provisions were scant. In numerous instances, global aid came sluggishly, and camps relied on Jewish groups like the Joint Distribution Committee or the ORT to maintain schools, clinics, kitchens, and shops. But primarily, what marks that phase is radical doubt. The Jews freed in 1945 did not know if the world would accept them, if it would recall them, if it would hear them. They did not know if they were survivors, if they were citizens, if they were Jews, if they were human. For years they trod through Europe bearing fake names, unfinished pasts, shattered bodies, and a narrative no one wished to hear. Their liberty was a deed of slow, patient, and deeply quiet defiance. A liberty that arrived not in the shape of an Allied banner, but in that of a private resolve to live when everything had said no. The post-war limbo and where they went after being liberated. For the majority of Jews surviving the Holocaust, liberation signified not the end of detention, but the start of a fresh captivity under another title. Rather than returning to homes, which often no longer stood, they were dispatched to temporary sites set up by Allied powers. These spots became known as displaced persons camps, or DP camps. Between 1945 and 1951, over 250,000 Jews moved through them, chiefly in the American, British, and French zones in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Yet these camps, though run by victors, held fences, towers, strict timetables, and censorship. And frequently, survivors found themselves dwelling beside former collaborators or even SS members. In the initial months after German surrender, the plight was dire. Allies did not distinguish between victims and culprits. The displaced were handled as a uniform mass, not as groups with unique pasts and needs. According to the Harrison Report by a United States presidential envoy who toured the camps in 1945, Jews were treated with equal indifference as common Germans lodged in filthy barracks, sans proper clothes or ample food. In certain camps, treatment was as inhumane as during war. Harrison was appalled and dispatched an urgent note to President Truman. Most of these Jews hold no prospect of returning to homes in Eastern Europe. Many have been assaulted or slain in the effort. In reply, a reorganization process commenced. Allies grasped that Jews required distinct areas and specific care. Thus were born solely Jewish camps like Feldafing, Landsberg, Furrenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. In these spaces, communities started rising anew from mud and debris. Schools, synagogues, periodical prints, theatre troupes, political parties, and Zionist youth groups were established. In the Bergen-Belsen camp, Rabbi Leo Baek led the initial formal religious rite after liberation, circled by survivors who still smelled of fumes and decay. Hebrew re-emerged as a tongue of schooling and defiance. Yiddish, too, became a vessel for cultural rebuilding. The DP camps became a kind of organized exile, a fleeting but vivid homeland, where for the first time in years, Jews could speak real names sans fear. Zionist groups utilized that space to drill future pioneers of the Jewish state. In the camps, adolescents were drilled. Hebrew tunes were taught. Dramas about the Exodus were staged. The term they used for themselves was She'erith Hapletar, the remainder of the saved. They were not survivors. They were what remained of the people. But even there, existence was shaky. Material states were poor, food rare, heat inept. In the winter of 1945, thousands perished of ailments like typhus, which had not yet been erased. Penicillin was rationed. The Joint Distribution Committee and other Jewish bodies, like ORT or HIAS, helped back clinics, kitchens, and schools, yet trauma lingered in every nook. In social worker reports, one phrase recurred: "The patient does not believe he is alive." Psychologists noted that many children knew not how to play, that adults ate anxiously and stashed bread under mattresses as if war persisted. To this was added the distress of waiting. The query was identical in all camps. And now, where to? For many, returning to origin countries was impossible or even lethal. In Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Hungary, anti-Semitic strikes continued. In cities like Krakow or Lublin, survivors were beaten, ousted, or slain. The Kielce pogrom, where a mob killed dozens of freed Jews, affirmed worse dreads. Europe did not desire them back. The United States, for its part, kept a strict immigration policy with paltry quotas. Palestine was blocked by the British, who feared Arab revolt if Jewish entry rose. Thus, thousands of Jews stayed stuck in camps where they lived in limbo. Neither captives nor free, neither citizens nor stateless, neither alive nor dead. In a British paper from 1946, an officer termed the camps as ghost eaters. The word was not metaphorical. Many still bore tattoos on arms, others knew not even their true surname, and several continued weeping every night the names of lost children. Despite everything, life proceeded. Children were born in camps, weddings were held, poems were penned. In the camp of Landsberg, the journal Unser Wort printed political pieces, tales, satires, and memoirs. In the Furrenwald DP camp, a youth named Yitzhak founded a Yiddish theatre troupe, and adapted works by Sholem Aleichem. In Feldafing, a survivor from Vilna taught history lessons to children who recalled not what a school was. Jewish identity was rebuilt upon the debris of the prior world, with a stubbornness that held no logical reason. It was merely impossible not to do so. But not everyone wished to stay. The majority longed to leave anywhere. In secret, thousands joined covert immigration webs, organized by the Brisha, which guided groups from Poland to Italy or the French coast across the Alps. From there, they boarded makeshift ships bound for Palestine, defying the British naval blockade. The most famed episode was that of the Exodus 1947, a vessel with over 4,500 Jews that was stopped and whose travelers were returned to Germany, where they were re-interned in British camps ringed by wire. The image was crushing. Jews locked up again in Germany by British troops in the name of global diplomacy. In response to public anger, the global community started shifting its stance. The United States pressured to ease migration. Truman signed in 1948 a special act to permit the entry of 80,000 displaced persons, many of them Jews. The creation of the State of Israel that same year finally opened a feasible goal, but not sans risks. Departing for a nation at war was not an easy choice, yet for thousands it was better to keep waiting amidst mud, military ration cans, and the pitying gazes of foreign troops. The DP camps emptied slowly. Some were deserted in 1949. Others ran until 1951. By then, the bulk of surviving Jews had scattered across North America, Israel, Australia, or Latin America. But the years in camps marked their lives in an indelible mode. In those spaces of transit, of grief and rebuilding, a new global Jewish community was created, born not from synagogues, nor from study, but from mud, from hunger, and from the need to envision a feasible future. They were camps where liberty did not yet exist. But the will to live had already been revived, and that was sufficient for the moment to endure one more day. Anti-Semitism after Auschwitz. When the Allies took Berlin, Nuremberg, Vienna, and Munich, when the gates of Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Mauthausen were unlocked, many believed or wished to believe that anti-Semitism had been vanquished along with the Third Reich. It was a perilous illusion. The industrial engine of extermination halted, yet the hatred was not dismantled, nor purged, nor exorcised. Anti-Jewish violence did not cease with the ovens of Auschwitz. It morphed, shifted, altered shape. In some parts of Europe, it revived with the identical language of hate as before, as if the 6 million slain had not been ample to persuade the world that anti-Semitism was a lasting threat. The most brutal, most symbolic, most scandalously ignored case was the Kielce pogrom in Poland on the 4th of July of 1946. A 9-year-old Christian lad, Henryk Błaszczyk, vanished for 2 days. When he returned, he stated he had been in the home of some Jews. No one investigated further. The police affirmed the rumor as fact, and with that fuel, fury erupted. An armed throng with clubs, stones, and guns went to number 7 on Planty Street, where a shelter for repatriated Jews operated. For several hours, the mob assaulted those living there, beating them, shooting, throwing furniture and bodies out windows. 42 people perished, many at the hands of Polish police and soldiers who failed to intervene or actively joined the massacre. Kielce was not a lone event. It was the peak of a string of attacks and harassment endured by Jews attempting to return to towns in Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Lithuania, and Romania. Returning was frequently more perilous than remaining in displaced persons camps. Those arriving back in cities found homes occupied, shops looted, their existence denied or abhorred. Some were slain just as they stepped off the train. Anti-Semitism no longer required the Gestapo. The local community took charge of reminding them they were not welcome. In Poland, between 1945 and 1947, over 1,000 documented episodes of violence against surviving Jews were noted, including lynchings, beatings, thefts, and the burning of synagogues and graveyards. Many Christian Poles feared Jews would reclaim properties confiscated or inherited after deportation. The hate was masked as property defense or nationalism. But at its core, it was the same racial spite that had fed pogroms for centuries. In Germany, meanwhile, the official pro-Allied discourse damned anti-Semitism. But in streets, survivors were still viewed as intruders. In a British intelligence report from 1946, it was noted that an alarming share of the German populace believed Jews are exploiting the situation, that they overstate their suffering, and that it is time they ceased complaining. For some, the Jew remained the scapegoat par excellence, blamed for war, for communism, for capitalism, for hunger, for occupation. The narrative had not shifted. It had only been tuned so as not to draw the notice of American uniforms. To this was added indifference. In Dresden, a German woman griped in a letter to the editor that Jews demand too much space in papers when there are so many hungry Germans. In a report from the French zone, anonymous tracts were found urging the ousting of remaining Jews from the Rhineland. Even in displaced persons camps, survivors suffered bias and harassment by German guards or locally hired civilian staff. In the Forenwald camp, a young Polish woman reported a German nurse shouted at her, "If you died, it was for a reason, and if you live, it is out of pity." In Hungary, after Soviet liberation, anti-Semitism mutated into anti-bourgeois language masked as class struggle. Surviving Jews were charged with becoming rich during war, collaborating with communists, or controlling black markets. In reality, many lived in wretched states, sans shoes, sans family, sans documents. But resentment was stronger than truth. In Miskolc in 1946, rumors spread that Jews used Christian children's blood for rituals. There were assaults, stones hurled, and several dead. Often survivors were accused of faking. In France, for instance, several right-wing papers printed pieces denouncing false deportees and accused Jewish groups of inflating victim counts to gain redress. The same pattern recurred in Belgium, Italy, Austria, and Romania. Suspicion, a mix of envy, guilt, and denial, tainted the most basic social bonds. In a village near Lviv, a Ukrainian family asked Soviet officials not to permit the return of those annoying Jews who invent tales of ovens and toxic showers. Horror was easily denied when one wished to deny it. Allied forces reacted late and warily. Although there were formal censures, there was no systematic policy to erase social anti-Semitism. Denazification courts in Germany focused more on formal ties than real attitudes. Many judges who in the 1930s had chased Jews returned to posts. In Austria, the popular tale was that the country had been a victim of Nazism, not an accomplice. Hence, crimes against Jews were minimized or relativized. In Italy, the situation was alike. Fascism was rejected, but deported Jews were an awkward nuisance, a guilt no one wished to bear. One of the most perverse effects of this lingering anti-Semitism was the silence of many survivors. They feared not being believed. They knew the world did not want to hear. In displaced persons camps, in reception homes, in trains, many avoided telling what they had seen. Speaking was remembering, but it was also risking scorn. A girl interviewed by Rebecca Clifford in Survivors recalls that when she tried to say she had seen her mother die before her, the teacher replied, "That is a nightmare. Stop making things up." The trauma was often double. What happened and what was not wanted to be heard afterward. Thus, the post-war world was not for Jews a stage of repair and empathy. It was a minefield of suspicions, humiliations, and new silences. Anti-Semitism had not died in Auschwitz. It had survived along with them. Only now it did not wear a uniform nor speak in German. Now it was in the murmurs, in the crooked looks, in the police who did not act, in the neighbor who closed the door. It was that anti-Semitism that pushed thousands to leave Europe, not because they could not live, but because they understood they would no longer be allowed to do so as Jews. The dilemma of staying or immigrating far from still Nazi Germany. For the Jews who survived the Nazi hell, the most difficult question was not how to keep living, but where. The continent that had been their home for generations had turned into a cemetery. There were no houses, no neighbors, no recognizable streets. In many cases, there were no families left, no synagogues, no entire cemeteries. Europe was in ruins, yes, But Jewish life was even more destroyed, turned into smoke, into bones, into handwritten records from concentration camps. Faced with this panorama, the decision about the immediate future became an existential dilemma: to stay or to leave. It was not a free choice. It was a decision shaped by fear, by loss, by persistent anti-Semitism, by political pressure, and by material limitations. Many survivors did not know if they could return to their places of origin, and if they did, whether they would be accepted or killed. Others did not know where to go, nor how to begin. Some, out of exhaustion, or because they did not have the strength to cross another country, with nothing but what they wore, decided to stay at least for a time in the same displaced persons camps where they had been housed by the Allies. Others, from the first day of freedom, sought a way to leave Europe forever, even if it meant embarking on clandestine journeys, crossing illegal borders, or waiting years for a visa. Michael Brenner, in After the Holocaust, shows in detail how this decision divided the Jews in Germany between those who believed in the reconstruction of Jewish life upon the ruins of the Reich and those who saw in the diaspora or in the new state of Israel the only possible way out. In cities such as Berlin or Munich, some community leaders began to organize cemeteries, schools, synagogues, newspapers, even marriages. They attempted to restore a cultural and religious life that would give meaning to survival, especially among German Jews who had returned from exile or from Soviet captivity. But it was not simple. Rubble was everywhere, and so was anti-Semitism. In rural areas of Bavaria, the mere fact that a Jew walked down the street generated rejection. In other cases, there were simply no other Jews left with whom to rebuild anything. On the other hand, the Jews of Eastern Europe did not want to live again under the same roofs where they had been betrayed. In Poland, for example, those who returned often found their houses occupied by neighbors who refused to return the properties. Sometimes they were expelled with violence, and other times they were killed. It did not matter that they had papers or that they had been deported from there. They were seen as intruders, as threats, as vengeful ghosts. Thus, many who had originally thought of going back home quickly changed their minds upon discovering that they no longer had a home or a country. In the words of a survivor quoted by Brenner, "Where I was a child, now I am a foreigner. Where I was a victim, now I am a suspect." In the midst of this confusion, immigration became an obsession, a necessity, a hope. But it was not easy. The United States maintained a system of restrictive and complex immigration quotas. Great Britain, which administered Palestine under the League of Nations mandate, severely restricted the entry of Jews for fear of tensions with the Arab population. Only 1,500 Jews per month were allowed to enter legally. The rest, tens of thousands, were considered illegal immigrants and were intercepted at sea. Many were returned to Europe, even to Germany. The most symbolic case was that of the Exodus 1947, a ship with more than 4,500 refugees, which was rejected by the British and whose passengers ended up being forcibly relocated to detention camps in Hamburg. For the survivors who disembarked from that ship, the humiliation was absolute. After having escaped the Nazi camps, they were imprisoned again in Germany, guarded by armed soldiers. Faced with the impossibility of immigrating legally, clandestine networks emerged that tried to get the survivors off the continent. One of the most active was the Breacher, a secret organization that helped Jews escape from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania to Italian or French ports. Thousands crossed borders at night with children in their arms, crossing the Alps on foot, hidden in trucks or in cold train wagons. From Genoa or Marseille, they tried to board small, fragile ships that would take them to Palestine. The conditions were extremely harsh: hunger, cold, surveillance, detentions. But many preferred that risk to continuing to survive among the ashes of Europe. At the same time, Jewish organizations in Latin America, Canada, Australia, and South Africa began to mobilize to receive refugees. Argentina, for example, was one of the few countries to accept a significant number of surviving Jews, especially between 1946 and 1948. But even in the countries that offered asylum, integration was neither immediate nor easy. The language, the poverty, the pain, the feeling of having arrived late to life, everything conspired against peace of mind. Even so, many clung to that unknown land as the only possibility of starting anew without looking back. In the political sphere, the creation of the State of Israel in May of 1948 functioned as a definitive catalyst for thousands of Jews in the displaced persons camps. The birth of the new state was a concrete, tangible sign that the Jewish people could still have land, an army, a language, and dignity. A massive exodus toward Israel was organized now with institutional backing. In the camps where Hebrew had previously been taught clandestinely, maps of the new state were now printed. The Hatikvah was sung. Enlistment forms were distributed. Many of those who immigrated in those years quickly integrated into the new country, even participating as soldiers in the War of Independence. Others became part of the civil fabric of the young state: teachers, doctors, farmers, parents. However, not everyone wanted to leave. Some, above all, the elderly, the weakened, those who no longer had strength, chose to stay. In West Germany, small Jewish communities began to be rebuilt in cities such as Frankfurt, Berlin, or Dusseldorf. Many of those who stayed were employed by the Allied forces as interpreters, doctors, teachers, or technicians. There were also those who wanted to bear witness, write, denounce, and considered that their place was there where everything had happened. The creation of the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland, Central Council of Jews in Germany, in 1950 was a sign that in spite of everything, some Jews still considered that Germany could once again be a place of Jewish life. Although the memory of the past was omnipresent for some, survival also meant regaining the right to live wherever they wished, even there where they had once been meant to be erased. The fate of the Jewish children. At first, they were small numbers pinned to the coat of a boy who did not know how to read his surname. In a white room, a nurse took his temperature. A doctor opened his mouth with a tongue depressor. Someone noted that he had lice, scabies, persistent cough. On the medical card, they wrote language undefined. The child did not respond in Polish, nor in Hungarian, nor in German. He had learned shouted orders and scattered words to survive. No one knew his real name. In many post-war children's homes, the first act of reconstruction consisted of naming again, searching for a record, a photo, a letter, something that would return to that child's body, a history. In the corridors of the foster homes, a borrowed castle on the outskirts of Paris, a stone mansion in the English countryside, a confiscated school in Bavaria, the adults drew up inventories of childhood, height, weight, marks on the skin, scars, languages, prayers. They remembered surnames that perhaps were not theirs. There were children who called themselves by the name a nun had whispered to them to avoid a patrol. Others kept the Yiddish pronunciation of a grandmother they could no longer remember. The name was a key if it opened. Relatives came; if not, the past remained empty. Many would grow with that gap, whole persons with a beginning amputated. Play, that natural grammar of childhood, came late or deformed in the yards. Some children did not know what to do with a ball. Others responded to a whistle as if it were a factory siren and lined up by reflex. Teachers recorded behaviors we would now call trauma, hypervigilance, startle at any noise, hoarding of food, bread hidden under the mattress, a potato kept in the pocket because tomorrow could always be a day without soup, bedwetting at night in boys already old enough to feel shame, selective mutism in girls who spoke alone but not in front of strangers, nightmares that left them exhausted and condemned them to sleep on tiptoe in case they had to run. They were taught to play as one teaches a language. A teacher drew a house and asked them to copy it. Sometimes there appeared walls without doors, windows with bars, chimneys that emitted black smoke. A boy painted a tree with fruit and hung a sign that said, "No entry." He said it was his forest, the only one where no one found them. Another filled a paper with invented names and recited them as if they were a prayer, a desperate attempt to fix identities that escaped him. In an English home, a psychologist observed that the youngest calmed down with inventories, not with stories. They listed how many spoons were on the table, how many chairs, how many steps from the bed to the door. The certainty of the count returned a bit of control. It was not uncommon for the children to arrive baptized or with foreign religious habits, the result of convents and families who had hidden them. The dilemma was harsh: to strip them of that belonging at once, to return them to an identity that in some cases they did not remember. There were custody trials that lasted for years. Catholic families who had saved a life claimed the continuity of the bond. Jewish organizations demanded the return to the community of origin, even when that community was an abstraction made of absentees. While the adults litigated, the child looked at two worlds that asked for opposite loyalties. They were asked to choose at 10 years old what sometimes they could not even name. The search for relatives was a collective right. In the displaced persons camps, bulletin boards were hung with typewritten lists of surnames, dates, and towns. Those who passed by with blurred vision put their finger where they thought they recognized something and asked about a person they did not know how to hold in memory. The tracing organizations, Red Cross, restitution offices, improvised archives, received envelopes with torn photos, letters, pendants, medals, medallions. Sometimes an uncle arrived, sometimes someone who said he was, and sometimes the one who arrived was a new past with another name, another language, and another religion. Many accepted a biography out of trust because the adult who brought it cried and brought bread. Years later, that white lie would become a crack. In the children's homes, the rules were a refuge. Meals were at fixed hours, hands were washed, beds were made with military hospitality. Lines were formed to enter the dining room. Some directors forbade speaking of the past. They believed that closing that door was the only way to build a useful future. Others promoted talking circles, drawings, small ceremonies to say farewell to the absent. No formula was perfect. Silence was made of modesty and fear, but also of emotional economy. The adults who had seen too much did not always have the strength to sustain the children's stories. There were caregivers who acted as mothers without ever using the word. There were directors who were survivors and who taught how to conjugate the verb to live with a fierce patience. School was the first laboratory of integration. Teaching to read to someone who spoke 3 languages poorly was not a matter of grammar, but of belonging. In some homes, Hebrew was chosen as the language of the future. In others, the language of the host country. In many, Yiddish continued to be the mother tongue of those who no longer had a mother. Literacy came with an unexpected gift, the possibility of writing one's own name on a sheet of paper and later on a document. Many children kept their first signatures as relics. It was the material proof that they existed without the permission of the past. Adolescence arrived like a second assault. Bodies grew, and with them certain memories that had lain dormant. For some, the first infatuation stumbled upon survivors' guilt. With what right to feel happy? Others channeled the energy into trades, carpentry courses, printing, electricity, sewing. Manual repetitive work healed through rhythm. Weaving restored weave. Wood obeyed and returned to shape. Where there had been dread, making was a way of thinking. In the host countries, the adults projected expectations. In Israel, the boy who became strong, sunburned, who learned to plant and to carry a rifle, was valued. In the United States or in Argentina, the one who integrated, quickly learned the language, and became useful and discreet was celebrated. That gaze shaped biographies. Many learned to act resilient so as not to be sent back to the social worker's office. Being the lucky ones was a label that obliged silence. If you were alive, you had to be grateful. If you spoke of nightmares, you were out of tune. Nevertheless, there were adults who listened. Psychologists and educators took notes without judging, observed the games, identified patterns, imagined treatments when the word trauma was still not common currency. Some caregivers prohibited shouting and whistles, understood that sound could be a trap. Rituals of predictability were established, announcing a change in advance, describing the steps of an excursion, guaranteeing that the hallway light would remain on. It was discovered that putting into words what was going to happen lowered the children's pulse, as if the future could be tamed with a simple script. Family reunifications were often collisions of tectonic plates. A father returning from a Soviet camp encountered a son who already had another voice, another bed, another mom who was not his dead wife. An aunt who had survived in hiding wanted to impose a tradition that the child did not recognize as their own. There were hugs that lasted a minute and then became rough routine, dishes that did not taste the same, stories that did not match, silences that unintentionally offended. Some children chose to remain with the foster families. Others departed to new countries with an almost unknown adult, and learned that loyalty can be a fragile bridge. As the years went by, many of those children became storytellers. They learned to speak without collapsing, measured the dose of memory so as not to drown the listener nor themselves. Some legally adopted the name they had been given to save them. Others recovered an old one and carried it like a medal and a question. In newly begun albums, they pasted the first photographs taken afterward. Those from before almost never existed. When they were asked for documents, their life began on the date of registration at a children's home. The bureaucratic world accepted that fiction because it was practical. They accepted it because it gave them a date of birth. In that post-war childhood, there were also joys without explanation. An excursion to the lake in summer, the discovery that bread could be eaten without hiding it, the wonder of a cinema for the first time, a song learned in chorus that closed the throat with emotion without knowing why. And there were absolute friendships, blood pacts, between children who did not want to lose each other again. In many houses, a teacher pinned a world map to the wall and asked them to mark with a pin where they wanted to go. Some stuck the pin in a place they did not know how to pronounce. Others in the country where they were, others did not stick it anywhere. They remained looking at the ocean as if it were a blank blackboard. The survivors who created Israel. When the trains stopped running to the camps and the gas chambers fell silent, hundreds of thousands of Jews wandered through a Europe that no longer had a place for them. They were not citizens, nor did they have homes to return to. For many of them, the only place that offered a horizon was a piece of land they did not know, but which in whispers and songs had been imagined for generations. Palestine. That territory under British administration since the end of the Ottoman Empire was seen not only as a refuge, but as a long-postponed promise. In the years immediately after the war, that promise took concrete form. The news from the extermination camps, the images of the living skeletons liberated by the Allies, the stories of orphaned children of survivors without a country or family struck deep in the conscience of many Jewish communities. The idea of rebuilding life in the places where it had been destroyed seemed unthinkable to some and deeply unwanted to others. What sense was there in returning to the house from which they had been expelled with blows when the neighbors had remained silent or collaborated? What could a continent offer that had not prevented their extermination? Migration to Palestine then became a cause, a campaign, and an epic. It was not easy. The British government, pressured by conflicts with the local Arab population, severely limited Jewish immigration. Dozens of clandestine ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying survivors hidden below deck, sick, hungry, exhausted. Some were intercepted by British patrols and their passengers interned in Cyprus or sent back to Europe. In other cases, the ships sank or were attacked, like the famous Exodus 1947, whose fate mobilized international public opinion. Despite the restrictions, the massive arrival of Jews to the British Mandate became an irreversible political fact. For the newcomers, Palestine was not an idyllic promised land, but a difficult frontier with languages they did not understand, a hostile climate, tensions with the Arab inhabitants, and unfamiliar social structures. Many came from displaced persons camps, from collective homes, or from years of hiding in forests and cellars. They were broken people with silent stories who landed in a society that valued strength, physical labor, and self-sufficiency. There was a deep gap between the heroic narrative of the pioneer who builds a nation from nothing and the silent survivor who carried invisible scars. Even so, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was received by much of the Jewish world as a rebirth. Not only political, but symbolic. For the first time in centuries, Jews would have their own army, their own government, a flag that represented them. It was an act of restitution in the face of history. In that new state, every survivor had a place, but there were also implicit conditions. The past had to be useful, had to merge with the national narrative, had to be read as a lesson in resistance and not as an open wound. Many who had been children in the ghettos or the camps suddenly found themselves in uniform, learning to handle weapons, swearing loyalty to a country that was just being born. Some participated in the War of Independence. Others worked in kibbutzim or were placed in schools and boarding houses where they were encouraged to forget Yiddish, the customs of Eastern Europe. The pain. The new Hebrew was a language of the future, of construction, not of mourning. Life in Israel was not a magical solution to suffering. Integration was uneven. There were prejudices toward the newcomers, especially those who did not adapt quickly to the dominant Zionist model. Trauma was not discussed. For years, speaking about the Holocaust was frowned upon, even associated with shame or weakness. Only in the 1960s, with the Eichmann trial and the emergence of the first survivor associations, did that perception begin to change. Despite everything, the very existence of Israel altered the emotional map of the Jewish people. It gave a center to a dispersed diaspora, offered a tangible alternative to exposure. For many who had lost everyone, who did not know where their parents or siblings were buried, planting a tree on a deserted hill, building a house in a new village, constructing a school with names that no one remembered anymore, was a form of active mourning. It was not about returning to the past, but about creating a place where that past could not be repeated. The hidden children surviving under another name. Not all Jewish children survived the Holocaust in camps or ghettos. Thousands did so, hidden behind an identity that was not their own. During the years of persecution, when the German machinery of extermination spread across all of Europe, many families chose the only possibility that left some hope: separating the children, leaving them with strangers, inventing them a surname, a religion, a story. In some cases, it was a planned decision. In others, a desperate act in the middle of a raid. They were handed over to peasants, to nuns, to childless couples, to former employees, to trusted neighbors. Sometimes they were hidden in cellars, in barns, in rural schools, or they were sent with groups of orphans, hoping they would get lost among them. They were 2 or 3 years old. Some barely knew how to speak. For years they lived as others. They responded to new names. They learned to recite Catholic prayers. They were baptized. They called Mama another woman. They forgot that they had once had a brother, a house, a cradle in another language. Some were very well treated. They received affection, food, shelter. Others suffered neglect, beatings, rapes, but all had in common a wound, the lie, the rupture, the uprooting. They were children who could not ask questions, who had to be careful not to talk in their sleep, who did not understand why they were alive when so many others were not. When the war ended, the situation was not resolved. In many cases, no one came looking for them. Their parents had been murdered. There were no relatives left, and even when an uncle appeared, a cousin, a gaunt mother who had survived Auschwitz or Siberia, the children did not always want to leave. Some resisted, screamed, ran away. They did not understand who that sad adult was who hugged them crying. For them, their life was another, their surname was another, their God was another. What came before was covered by a thick veil of forgetfulness and confusion. There were legal battles in France, in Belgium, in Italy. Courts decided over the identity of the children. Some foster families refused to hand them over. They argued that they had saved their life, that they had raised them, that they were no longer Jewish. In many cases, they were right. The children knew nothing of their origin. They did not understand the rituals, did not speak the language of their grandparents. In British Mandate Palestine, Jewish organizations fought to bring these children to what would become the future state of Israel. They said they were part of the people who had suffered, that they had to be rebuilt as Jews. On the other side, Catholic institutions clung to their custody. Some had been baptized, and according to canon law that made them part of the church. The fight was not only legal, it was symbolic. To whom did a child without parents, without a name, without memory belong? Was he a survivor or a hostage? Did he have the right to ignore his past? Should he be returned to an identity he did not remember? Or could he choose the one he had learned during the war? There were no simple answers. Each case was unique, but all shared the same tension. The conflict between the love received and the truth denied, between the adopted identity and the one that had been torn away. In the following years, many of these children rebuilt their stories piece by piece. Some did so as adults, searching archives, letters, lists, witnesses. Others never succeeded. They carried a suspicion, an intuition, a void. There were those who discovered the truth by accident, by a conversation overheard in secret, by a forgotten document, by a photograph hidden in a box. For many, knowing who they were was a painful process that did not bring immediate comfort. Some rejected their origin, others embraced it with fervor as a mission. Some never managed to integrate it fully. Most lived with a broken identity. When speaking about their childhood, they did not know where to start. They had two births, two genealogies, two memories, often contradictory. They were not only children of the shower, they were survivors in a more solitary and ambiguous way. They did not see the gas chambers, but they lived entire years hiding who they were. And when they could say it, they were no longer sure they were. In the following decades, these children became adults with a particular sensitivity. Many devoted themselves to memory, to psychology, to history. Some isolated themselves, others built families obsessed with the truth. Almost all felt that they had lost something essential, even if they did not always know how to name it. The victims who were forgotten. Just a few months after the liberation of the camps, when the physical wounds had not yet healed, nor had they managed to understand what they had lived through, they encountered a society busy rebuilding cities, economies, alliances, and borders. The urgency of the present left no room for the voices of the past. In many countries, the survivors' accounts were uncomfortable, unbearable, or outright denied. No one wanted to hear about the trains, the hunger, the selections, the ovens. The first form of repression was silence. In France, Belgium, Hungary, the Netherlands, or Poland, the official narrative tended to subsume Jewish suffering within the general suffering of the war. We were all victims, it was said. But the Jewish experience had been different. They had not died in bombings, nor on battlefields, but in gas chambers, in ditches they themselves had dug, in camps where the crime was systematic and bureaucratic. Silence was in those contexts a way of erasing that difference. On an individual level, many survivors also chose to remain silent. Not by will, but by necessity. The pain was so deep, so unutterable that words became treacherous. And when they tried to speak, the reaction of the other was often evasive, mocking, or distrustful. There were those who did not believe something so monstrous could have been possible. Others said, there must have been a reason. There was no shortage of those who attributed survival to supposed collaboration with the Nazis. Thus, speaking about the past became a double sentence, reliving the horror and being judged for having lived it. Stigma surrounded many of those who left the camps. In Eastern Europe, where the new communist regimes promoted a collective vision of wartime suffering, Jews who spoke about the extermination were accused of particularism, of wanting to differentiate themselves. In some cases, they were even persecuted or censored for insisting on telling their story. In the Western countries, by contrast, the gaze was more insidious. Survivors were perceived as marked bodies, as uncomfortable symbols, as reminders of what had been allowed. This marginalization was not only symbolic. In many communities, survivors found no support networks. They were not received with compassion, but with distance. They were seen as broken, difficult, traumatized people. At times, they were kept away from jobs, from possible marriages, from community positions. Women especially suffered a double invisibility for having been victims and for being women in patriarchal contexts, where speaking of rape, humiliation, or sterility was taboo. The children who had survived under false identities encountered a different rejection. Some were returned to distant relatives who did not recognize them, or to communities that questioned their origin. Their childhood, marked by displacement, loss, and fear, found no place in a society that idealized innocence and post-war joy. They were expected to be normal, to study, to grow, to be grateful. But many continued sleeping with a knife under the pillow or hoarding breadcrumbs, as in the camps. This general climate of silence and stigmatization had profound consequences. For 2 decades, testimonies were sporadic, marginal. Memoirs were published, such as Primo Levi's, but with little impact. Survivors were not seen as sources of knowledge, but as uncomfortable witnesses. Their stories were too dark, too brutal. Schools did not teach what had happened. The media did not speak about the crematoria or the camps. Only from the 1960s, and with even greater force in the 70s and 80s, did this trend begin to change. The trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem was a turning point. For the first time, survivors' testimonies were heard on an international broadcast. The victims began to occupy the center of the narrative. They were no longer shadows walking among the living, but voices that challenged history. Nevertheless, this recognition came late and did not reach everyone. Many died before being heard. Others could never break the wall of inner silence. Over the years, some began to speak within the family, others before school groups, some before a camera. Each testimony was an intimate repair, but also a way of confronting the trauma, the incomplete memory, the pain that did not cease. And even so, every time someone recounted what they had lived, they felt again, even if only for a moment, not judged, not forgotten, not alone. The forgotten of reparations, the victims without compensation. In the years that followed the end of the war, the world witnessed an unprecedented phenomenon. Millions of victims demanded justice, memory, and reparations. But in the case of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, not all received what they expected. Although bilateral agreements were signed, compensation committees were created, and organizations such as the Claims Conference managed thousands of payments, a significant portion of survivors was left out because of the fine print, the deadlines, the legal categories imposed from distant offices, the lack of evidence, omission, arbitrariness, or simply not being in the right place at the right time. The first major agreement was signed in 1952 between the Federal Republic of Germany and Israel, along with the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. This historic pact recognized in general terms Germany's moral and financial obligation to compensate Jews persecuted by the Nazi regime. Israel would receive a lump sum to help absorb and settle the survivors arriving from Europe. In addition, individuals could apply for personal compensation for persecution, forced labor, loss of property, or imprisonment. But that apparent generosity concealed exclusionary criteria. To be compensated, the survivor had to prove having been persecuted for racial or religious reasons. Those who could not clearly document their status or who had been in territories under Soviet occupation were excluded. And even more seriously, many victims who had survived in hiding for years without having passed through concentration camps did not qualify as persecuted under German bureaucratic criteria. Those who had saved their lives by fleeing, changing identity, hiding in cellars or convents were considered not eligible, as if only deportation validated suffering. Others were excluded for geographical or political reasons. Survivors living in Eastern Europe, especially in the Soviet Union, Romania, or Hungary, could not apply for compensation until decades later, and in many cases never did. There were no German consulates, no available information, no safe channels. For those living under communist regimes, speaking about German compensation was also politically risky. As a result, tens of thousands of people who had lost their families, homes, and communities died without having received a single cent. In Latin America, there were also forgotten ones. Many Jews who immigrated to Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, or Mexico did so with false papers, reconstructed identities, or without any documentation proving their time in camps or ghettos. Others never knew they had the right to start a claim or found out when it was already too late. Some were illiterate, elderly, without networks or information. The process was long in German or Hebrew, requiring documents, witnesses, stamps, old passports, arrest certificates, receipts for expropriated properties. Who could prove anything after fleeing through forests or after losing everything in a train station? Also excluded for legal reasons were those who had suffered persecution under regimes allied with the Third Reich, such as in Hungary or Romania before 1944. Germany argued that it was not responsible for crimes committed by other states, even if the perpetrators acted in coordination with the Nazis. The result was that thousands of victims of Hungarian ghettos, forced labor camps in Transylvania, or detainees of the Romanian gendarmerie were left without recognition or compensation. Added to this were differences in the real value of the pensions received. A survivor in Germany could receive a monthly compensation of up to 300 German marks with health coverage included. One in Israel, by contrast, had to settle for smaller amounts without the same benefits, and one in Argentina or Canada could only access occasional payments managed by NGOs without any access to state support. This inequality generated resentment among the survivors themselves, who began to divide between the compensated and the not compensated. But beyond the figures, what hurt was the criteria. To receive a pension for psychological damages, for example, a specific level of medical impairment had to be proven. How is the trauma of having seen your parents die measured? How is the chronic anguish of living without knowing what happened to your siblings proven? How can the fear of a childhood spent underground or the silence of a woman raped in a labor camp be quantified? The logic of the forms could not capture the ineffable. Over the years, some doors opened. Germany extended deadlines, loosened criteria, enabled new programs. Some excluded categories were finally recognized, such as survivors of certain ghettos not officially considered closed, or those who had been in forced labor camps outside the concentration camp system. Programs were also created for those who had been in hiding or had lived in inhuman conditions in occupied territories. But by then, many had already died. The institutions that managed the reparations were also subject to criticism. The Claims Conference in particular was denounced for its lack of transparency, its excessive bureaucracy, and for a case of internal corruption that broke out in 2010. Although it was responsible for distributing billions of dollars in compensation, it was accused by survivors of acting coldly, of imposing insensitive administrative criteria, and of not having done enough for the poorest or those living on the periphery. The word reparation suggests that something can be fixed, but for many that promise never came. Neither the money nor the recognition nor even the name on a list, only oblivion. Or worse still, suspicion. Because in some contexts, receiving compensation was seen as taking advantage of the tragedy, and many survivors hid the fact that they received a pension for fear of being stigmatized or misunderstood. Others never wanted to ask for anything out of dignity or distrust. They did not want alms. They said only justice. But justice, as always, came late or never came. 70 years after the end of the war, there are still closed archives, unresolved files, pending claims. There are still widows without compensation, children without recognition, victims without a voice. The reparation system was a step forward, but it was also a filter, a boundary between those who managed to be part of the official narrative of suffering and those who remained on the other side. What did not return? Returning was not always possible, and when it was, it did not mean going back. There was no possible reconstruction for many of the things that were lost. The shtetls where no one spoke Yiddish anymore, the synagogues reduced to warehouses or ruins, the cemeteries erased with shovels. Tens of thousands of Jews returned to their towns if they were still standing, and walked through familiar streets that no longer belonged to them. There were familiar faces, yes, but with closed doors, with voices that did not ask, did not greet, did not recognize. In many cases, they were the same people who had denounced or looted them during the occupation. Jewish life in Eastern Europe had been wiped out not only by death, but by the transformation of the landscape. In Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, or Hungary, the war had reformatted cities, social networks, properties, structures. Reopening a business, teaching Hebrew, restarting the liturgical calendar was an act of defiance. Some tried, a few succeeded, but the numbers were minimal. In cities such as Lodz, Kiev, Vilnius, or Bratislava, Jewish life was a distant echo. For many survivors, even outside Europe, there was no desire to remember. The past was a minefield they preferred not to tread. In the early years, testimonies found no listeners. Societies around the world, including Jewish ones in the diaspora, looked forward. People spoke of reconstruction, of progress, of family, not of Auschwitz, not of Treblinka, not of the ashes of the children. The women who had survived with broken lives kept silent. The men tried to become providers again, fathers, merchants. The children born after the war were raised in homes where photographs were missing, stories were avoided, and gestures were more eloquent than words. In many of those homes, pain was a language without translation. Israel was no exception. Although survivors were fundamental in building the new state, in the early years they were viewed with ambivalence. Some considered them the embodiment of the weakness of the European Jew in the face of Nazism. They were called sabonim, soap, in a cruel play on the fate symbolized by the crematoria. Only decades later, after the Eichmann trial, did survivors' testimonies begin to occupy a central place in Israel's national narrative. But for many, the process was long, lonely, and silent. Trauma seeped into daily life. Insomnia, fear of confinement, broken relationships, panic attacks. Some slept with knives under their pillows, others kept food in their pockets, some spoke in their sleep in languages their children did not understand. Mental illness, suicide, and the inability to form emotional bonds marked the lives of tens of thousands. Even those who managed to rebuild their lives in Canada, in France, in Argentina, in Australia, carried with them a permanent sense of unreality. It was common for them to say they were dead in life, that what came afterward was borrowed, stolen time. In many cases, they never told what they had lived through. Some waited decades to speak, others wrote it in secret, others denied it always. In every family, there was an empty chair, a burned letter, a nameless grave, a voice that did not have time to say goodbye. In Jewish communities around the world, commemorations multiplied, but mourning was incomplete. There were no bodies to bury. There were no last words. There was no justice for the majority. For the orphans, the lack of origin was a fracture without repair. Children who did not know their real surname, who did not know if they were Polish, Ukrainian, Hungarian, or simply Jewish. Some were raised by Christian families, others by Jewish institutions. Some jumped from country to country, carrying Red Cross folders and provisional identity certificates. One day they were David, another day they were Stefan or Moshe or Franz. Some lived entire years in DP camps, believing that was their homeland. Others never again spoke the language of their parents. There were also silences imposed by time. The oldest survivors died without telling. Others did so when no one asked anymore. For years, the Holocaust archive was made of scraps, diaries, letters, rescued photos, incomplete testimonies. The great figures, the 6 million, the camps, the dates, hid thousands of personal stories that were never told, not because they did not matter, but because no one listened.